Hi, I'm Graham Blackburn, and I've been making furniture for almost 40 years. Most of the time I get to make modern furniture, but occasionally I get to work on really old pieces, and that's what I have here. This is an example of a form of joinery known as frame and paneling, which is almost 500 years old. These two pieces of English brown oak, which date from around 1576, came out of an old manor house in the east of England, whole rooms of which were lined with beautiful frame and paneling work like this. The techniques involved in making this piece of frame and paneling are virtually identical to those we use today making a more modern example. And the reason for the survival of this particular joinery technique, or system of joinery, is that it addresses the eternal problem of wood's reaction to ambient moisture content. When it's damp, wood absorbs moisture and expands. When it gets dry, wood shrinks. And unless what we build accommodates this movement, we can run into a host of wood-related plagues, such as checked boards, failed joints, warped surfaces, all sorts of other things that you wouldn't want to consider. Uses for frame and paneling include entry doors, cabinet doors, carcasses and other parts of furniture, and all sorts of architectural elements. Say this is a doorway, and this is a door panel made of vertically joined boards. Instead of allowing the panel to expand against or contract away from the doorposts, we make the panel a little smaller than the opening and make up the difference with a wooden frame consisting of narrow members. The panel is contained by grooves formed in the inner edges of the surrounding framing members, but is free to float in the grooves, expanding and contracting across its width at will. The frame members themselves are so narrow that their expansion and contraction are small enough to be of no real consequence. The essential frame consists of the following elements: vertical stiles, horizontal rails, and if the frame is divided into more than one panel, a central muntin. Now we'll take this apart and examine these pieces more closely. The inside of all these framing members is grooved and also contains the mortises for the tenons on the ends of the rails. If in fact there are muntins, then the rails also will have mortises to receive their tenons. Generally, the bottom rail is the widest of all the members because it has to have the most substantial joint to support the weight of all the rest of the framing. However, sometimes a lock rail in the middle of the piece will be the widest member in order to accommodate deep mortise locks. The top rail, which is generally narrower than the bottom rail, has to be at least wide enough to contain a sufficiently wide tenon to give the whole piece some structural stability. Because it's easier to make a through groove than a stopped groove, the tenons on the rails are invariably haunched to fill the ends of the grooves. The muntins, which have a less important structural role to play, can be wide or, as in this case, can be narrower. The panels, which are the subject of a sequel to this video, are generally feathered or rabbited or tongued to fit into the stiles. Of course, the specific purpose of any given piece of frame and paneling will also have some effect on the final dimensions. This chest lid, lying flat and supported by the chest, doesn't need to have a bottom rail larger than any other member. In fact, the rails and stiles are all the same width. Similarly, if you're making a frame and panel door, you might have to allow for a wider stile to accommodate the lock hardware. And finally, frame and paneling that is used as wall paneling often has to be adjusted to allow for different sections being joined or different ways of being attached. Lastly, there's the question of design. You can make frame and paneling out of different woods, use contrasting grains and colors for the frame and panels, molding can be formed on or applied to framing members, and the panels themselves can be endlessly carved, veneered, or inlaid. The first step in making a section of frame and panelling, as with any project, is to get out the stock to the required dimensions. How you actually cut to length and width, joint and surface plane the material is largely a function of the tooling available in your shop. Now, if we're going to make a frame that measures approximately 24 inches by 18 inches, we'll need stiles, and we'll need rails, and we'll probably need a central mounting. Stock we need to form the rails can be 18 inches because this will leave us plenty of wood for the visible part, and it will leave us enough wood to make the tenons at either end. However, the stock that we're going to make the stiles from needs to be a little longer each end. We should make the stiles probably 27 inches because this will leave us extra wood to make disassembly and assembly easier. It'll prevent any danger of the mortise excavation from splitting the end of the wood, and it will finally make the overall trimming to the finished dimension a much neater and efficient job. The muntin, although it's considerably shorter even with the addition of its tenons here, is probably most conveniently got out in the beginning to the same length as the stiles. In any event, a little longer is always better than a little shorter. It's much harder to lengthen a piece of wood than it is to shorten it. Now, what about the grooves? As a general rule of thumb, it's a good idea to make the groove about 1/3 of the width of the stock. Of course, if you're using hardwood, which has more strength and the panel can resist the warping tendency better, a narrower groove might work. The next thing is to determine where you want the groove to be. If you want the panel to be centered, then a centered groove is a good idea. But if you wanted the panel to be deeply recessed, you might make the groove further to the back. And if you'd like the panel to be proud of the frame, then you could make the groove a little closer to the front of the framing. This way, when the panel goes in, you'll have a proud panel. And lastly, think ahead to the mortise you'll be making. If you can make the groove exactly the same width as the tool that you'll be using to make the mortise, then the mortise can be located exactly within the groove, and you'll eliminate the need for any further layout. When you have all the framing members cut to size and length, arrange them as they'll be assembled and mark them as a group with an upright triangle, so you'll know which is which when they're apart. Choose the tool that's going to make the groove. In this case, it's a 1/4 inch straight cutting iron from my Stanley 45 combination plane, and match it with the tool that you'll use to excavate the mortise. Both tools should approximate 1/3 of the member's thickness. Combination planes, like this Stanley 45, have been in continuous production in one form or another since the 1870s. While this may not be the perfect all-in-one plane that it sometimes claims to be, it does have a lot going for it. In particular, it's extremely adjustable, especially for basic operations such as rabbiting, ploughing and grooving, and it's always handy, ready to use. I adjust the plane's depth screw until the cutting edge just protrudes beneath the skates forming the plane's sole. These skates can also be adjusted to match the width of any cutting iron you choose. Now I attach the fence and place the sole of the plane where I want the groove to go. You don't have to measure the exact groove position on the edge of the frame members. If all the pieces are worked from the face side, the side we marked with the triangle, then all the grooves will be in the same relative position. With my rule, I note where its 1/4 inch mark falls on the side of the skate, and then I set the plane step stop to match this mark, and tighten the securing screw. I start at the near end with the fence held closely against the side of the workpiece. If the cutting edge is set to the correct depth for the wood you're grooving, continuous shavings will peel effortlessly out of the plane's mouth. If you're not a romantic like me, and like to hear the birds sing and to inhale the fresh wood aromas liberated by the plane, then there are of course other ways to plough a groove, including a dado blade set up on a table saw, or a router used freehand or mounted in a router table. The table-mounted router is the most sensible, it seems to me, because with a single fence setup, it'll handle all the frame parts you can throw at it, both for grooving and mortising. Run all the grooves first, lifting the bit 1/4 inch at a time. Then do the mortises like this. Extend the bit above the table to the full mortise depth and raise the work up on a stack of plywood shims, each 1/4 inch thick. The first pass will take off 1/4 inch. Sliding the workpiece between stops will limit its travel and guarantee a consistent and exact length for the mortise. After each pass, pull out another shim until you've completed the mortise. You can do similar work with a handheld plunge router, but unless it's carefully jigged, it's more prone to operator error. Now back to my pleasant shop, with no sawdust sprayed all over and no earplugs. As soon as you notice a change in the sound of the plane, proceed a little more carefully. You don't want to ride the plane so hard that the depth stop mars the surface of the wood. As soon as the depth stop on the combination plane contacts the surface of the wood, the shavings will cease to appear. I find it convenient to use a bench hook and a small piece of similarly thickness wood to support the workpiece while I mark around the end of a stile to lay out the tenon. These tenons should be about 1.25 inches long. The first step in guaranteeing equal shoulders is to make sure the pencil line connects all around the piece. Now lay out the cheeks with the workpiece in the vise. Set the spurs on your mortise gauge to the same width as the groove and position the gauge on the workpiece, being especially sure to bring the mortise gauge's stock up against the face side of the workpiece. Score across the end of the tenon, starting from the groove so that you can see the marks are aligned, and then score down the back of the workpiece, being careful not to go past the shoulder line. The next step is to cut a small groove for the saw to ride in. Use a tri-square and a marking knife. You might use a chisel here instead, but however you make this cut, the side of the groove against the line should be vertical. On the waist side, the cut can be slanted in towards the line. Cut the shoulder first. My preferred tool is an English dovetail saw that I've had recut with Japanese teeth. A few pulls backwards starts a clean curve. Then I try and keep the saw square by sighting past the saw's back down to the shoulder line. Obviously, this cut shouldn't go past the cheek line into the actual tenon. I want to check that I'm not cutting past the inside cheek line, the one that I can't see while I'm cutting. There are, of course, machine methods for cutting tenons, many methods. One sensible and reasonably safe way to do this is to cut shoulders on the table saw, using some kind of registration stop on the fence so that each tenon member can be automatically set for its cut once you've done your initial measuring. Then bandsaw the cheeks. Use a fence and a well-tuned machine, make some test cuts on some test pieces, and you can get exact cheeks right off the bandsaw. Start the cheek cut at the top corner so that you can see both the top line and the cheek line. Saw on the waist side of the line, of course. First saw all the way across the top. That'll give you a curve to keep the saw aligned as you concentrate on the cheek line. Sawing to a line is all about paying attention to what you're doing and standing properly. If you stand directly over the cut so that you can see both the end and the side cheek lines at the same time, and you keep your eye aligned with the blade and the blade aligned with the cut, there'll be little else to worry about. Be careful not to saw below the level of the shoulder. If you keep the saw square on the cheek, the waist should just fall off when you reach the shoulder. If you think you've sawn down to the line and the piece doesn't fall off, you may have to deepen the shoulder cut. If you cut the tenon a little too fat, you can easily break off any remaining slivers. Once you know how to prepare a saw for the work in hand, it should cut virtually under its own weight. In particular, if the saw is incorrectly set, it will want to lead off to one side. I should probably make a whole new video about how to use saws. Mark the haunch to be the same depth as the groove it will fill, in this case, 1/4 of an inch. Square off a line from this mark, and now you can determine the width of the tenon. The important thing is not to position the joint too close to the end of the stile, although at the same time you also want to make a wide enough tenon to form a strong joint. Square off the tenon end line perfectly perpendicularly to the shoulder. I've marked a tenon approximately 2 inches wide, which will leave almost an inch between the end of the mortise and the end of the stile. Now carefully saw down both marks to create a haunch tenon. Lightly chamfer all 4 edges of the tenon's end, and this will make assembly later much easier. When you've made tenons at both ends of both rails, arrange all the members as they'll go into the finished frame, but with the stiles rotated so that their grooves are facing upwards. Now I want to mark the location of the mortises in the stiles. I place the bottom rail so that the tenon shoulder is square against the stile, and so that the end of the stile projects just past the rail. This little tail on the end of the stile will make this assembly and final trimming much easier. Mark the mortises directly from the tenons. You don't need to measure anything, and the triangle marks we made earlier on the faces will help to reference each tenon to each mortise without confusion. If this layout passes your cat's inspection, then you can proceed to the next step. It's a good idea to fit a hand screw or a clamp of some kind over the end of the stile to protect against the possibility of splitting the mortise during excavation. Large mortises may be profitably pre-bored to remove the bulk of the waste, but for relatively small joints like these, a standard sash mortise chisel is sufficient. Start your excavation in the middle and work to one end, then work to the other. Each blow of the mallet will drive the waste into the wedge-shaped space just made. The idea is to remove most of the wood before you approach the ends. That's where you need perfectly vertical cuts, and with the central waste gone, there's no wood to push back against the chisel and crush the mortise corners. The sides of a mortise chisel are ground square so that if you work directly over the joint, it's easy to make a perfectly plumb cut. Check the depth periodically to make sure you've excavated sufficiently to receive the full length of the tenon. In this case, we need about 1.25 inches. Here's a trial fit. Present the tenon to its mortise and push home. A good joint should need just the slightest encouragement from a mallet before the shoulders meet the edges of the stile. The 2 pieces should lie in the same plane with their faces flush. Measure the finished length of the frame from the bottom rail. Do this on both stiles so that you know the top rail will be square. Now disassemble what we've got so far. Turn the stiles on edge, and on them locate the mortises for the top rail by squaring across the grooved edges as we did earlier. Align the top rail to these marks and then pencil in the mortise ends just as we did for the bottom rail. The muntins, tenons and mortises are all similarly made. Now, how do we get the measurements for the panels? Well, assemble the completed frame except for one stile. Take measurements between the insides of the rails and the stiles and add twice the depth of the grooves. So here it's 19.5 inches between the rails and 6 inches between the stile and the muntin. Add 2/4 inches to each and we'll find panels that need to be 20 inches by 6.5 inches. And I just happen to have some of these right here. Assemble a complete unit, starting with the muntin and rails. Slide in a panel, add its stile, and then slide in the other panel and fit its style. Whether you've made plain flush panels or raised panels like these, the result should be a perfectly flat, stable piece of woodwork that will accommodate changing ambient moisture conditions and still maintain its overall dimension. Here's another panel variation with simple fields. The panel is now ready for glue up, but first let me show you an old way of securing mortise and tenon framing without glue. This is a technique known as draw boring. It's a way of pinning the mortise in the tenon and at the same time of drawing the joint together as tightly as possible. Assemble the two parts of the joint and locate the position of the pin that will pass through both the mortise and the tenon. The strongest spot is somewhere near the middle of the actual tenon. I disassemble the joint and bore through the member containing the mortise. I work from both sides to ensure a clean exit hole. Then I reassemble the joint as tightly as possible, and working through the bored hole in the mortised member, I mark the exact center on the tenon. I make a second mark on the tenon just a little inside the original mark, and using this as a new center, bore through the tenon with the same bit as I used to bore through the mortise. I cut a pin somewhat longer than the thickness of the framing members, chamfer the ends so the pin won't damage the entry and exit holes of the mortised member, and drive the pin home. Since the holes are slightly offset, the driven pin will draw the tenon into the mortise, making for a perfectly tight joint. Tails away and trim the bottom edge. You don't have to use a high-end Norris smoother as I do here, but a sharp low-angle block plane may work as well.
Hello, I'm Graham Blackburn. In this, the second of two videos on the joinery system known as frame and paneling, I'm going to be showing you the secrets and the methods of making the panels. In the first video, I showed how to make the framing for this particular piece of woodwork. It might be a door or a lid or even a piece of case furniture. To recap briefly, this particular piece consists of two stiles, a bottom rail, a top rail, and a central dividing piece known as the muntin. Inside the frame are two panels that are held in the framing in a series of grooves cut inside the framing members. You can see how the panel can slide up and down and back and forward in the frame. Now, the central idea behind all frame and paneling is to allow the relatively wide panels to expand and contract within the frame without compromising the structural integrity or changing the overall dimensions. Any attempt to restrain this movement will inevitably lead to disaster. Pieces may become swollen and no longer fit, boards may check and crack. Smooth surfaces can become irregular as one piece swells or contracts more than its neighbor. You can't prevent this change, but with a system like frame and paneling, you can accommodate it. It can be used in furniture, such as cabinets and chests, or as an architectural element in the design of doors or wall coverings. Frame and paneling allows the wood to shrink or expand without compromising the appearance or functionality of the woodwork as a whole. Now that we know that all wood moves, it's important to take note of the fact that it moves more across the grain than it does with the grain. We can take advantage of this fact by constructing the framework out of relatively narrow pieces and leaving the bulk of any change to take place in the relatively wider panels. Another characteristic of framing is that because the various members are oriented in different directions, they tend to cancel out any tendency to warp or twist, and so the framing remains flat. This means we don't have to worry about keeping the panels flat, and panels can be made wider and thinner than would otherwise be prudent. In fact, making the panel thinner than the frame actually helps ensure that the frame will be stronger than the panel and will more easily resist its tendency to warp or cut. Now, before we get down to actual construction, let's talk a bit about the details of panel design. First of all, how big can we make a panel? Well, since most framing is usually made with grooves no more than 1/4 of an inch deep, we don't want to make a panel out of something that could shrink or expand more than 1/2 an inch. Whether it will or not depends on the kind of wood we use, whether it's softwood like this piece of pine that moves and expands a great deal, or something that's subject to less movement like a piece of hardwood like this oak. And secondly, it depends on where the piece is going to live, whether it will be in a relatively stable environment or somewhere where there's a great seasonal variety in the amount of moisture in the air. Next, remember that since wood movement is greater across the grain than with the grain, most panels tend to be taller than they are wide, and they're usually designed so that the long grain runs vertically. But this is by no means an absolute rule. Sometimes it looks better if some of the panels are wider than they're tall, although this is often done simply by orienting the long grain horizontally. The next thing to consider is how thick the panel should be. Well, as we saw, they can be as thin as the groove that contains them, like a lot of contemporary plywood panel doors, or they can be as thick as, or even thicker than, the actual framing. If they are thicker than the grooves, then something has to be done to get them to fit, and we'll talk about this in a moment. Then there's the question of the panel's composition. Although many panels are made from one piece of wood, there's no reason why they might not consist of several pieces. This is a great way to use up material too narrow for anything else. It can also be a great design element, especially if you glue together wood with contrasting colors or patterns. In fact, many panels made of highly figured wood often consist of 2 book-matched pieces. Lastly, panel design has a lot to do with how we fit the panel into its groove. This is the fun part. We can make flush panels, beaded to disguise dimensional changes, simple fielded panels, raised panels, inlaid panels, and even carved panels. The carving can range all the way from simple surface carving to something highly decorative. More ornate Gothic panels included linenfold and its varieties. As we've seen, the design possibilities for any panel are virtually endless, but there are 2 things that we must always bear in mind: grain orientation and tongue allowance. The simplest panel we can make is one that's no thicker than the framing grooves. All we have to do is to cut the panel to size, leaving an allowance for any possible expansion or contraction. Any panel thicker than the groove may still be perfectly flat, but it'll require a tongue. Whether this is formed in the center of the panel's edge, closer to one side than the other, or even flush with one face. The simplest way to form a tongue is to rabbet one edge, using your router or a table saw or even a rabbet plane. Instead of forming a 1- or 2-sided tongue on the edges of a panel by rabbeting, you could progressively thin down the panel's edges on one or both sides until they fit in the groove. This is known as feathering. A regularly feathered edge produces a central field and makes a strong design statement, but it requires that you pay attention to the relative proportions of the feathered edge and the framing itself. One way to make a fielded panel is by running it on edge through the table saw with the blade tilted. As a matter of safety, be sure to use a high fence, or even better, make a jig that will hold the panel in a safe manner. If you do use the table saw, remember you'll still have to finish with a plane to produce a presentable surface. So, why go through all that bother? Just use the hand plane. First, define the finished thickness on the edge of the panel, and then mark out the field on its surface using a pencil gauge. Plane the ends first, and then, when you plane the sides, any tear out at the ends will be removed. Just be certain to remember that if the feathering is too steep, there may not be enough movement possible in and out of the groove. Using a plane, you can do this very neatly. But in a lot of old work, and especially on the backs of panels in very old work, a draw knife was used. Its only purpose was to trim the panel down to fit the groove. When the cabinet was closed, you couldn't see how it was finished anyway. Before you dismiss this as a clumsy old technique, consider that one form of highly regarded surface preparation consists of an irregularly rippled and textured surface, especially effective on materials such as quarter-sawn oak.
If you don't feel so confident about planing nicely to a line, and a fielded panel with an irregularly defined outline can look pretty sloppy, you might try making a raised panel. This is a little more work, but in many ways it's a whole lot easier. There are special purpose panel planes, like this one here, designed to form a raised field, a regular bevel, and a flat tongue, but they only make one particular shape. It's the same thing with a router blade or a shaper bit. They work fine, they accommodate all these shapes, but they only make the one profile. But if you have a lot of the same panels to raise, it may be worthwhile to spend the money to buy one of these relatively expensive bits. On the other hand, if you have your own ideas about the size and slope of the bevel and the size of the raised field, it can be easier to use a combination of machine and hand methods.
The first step is to mark out and then define the field. I use a rabbet plane, but a table saw might be used just as well. The second step is to cut the bevel. If you do use a table saw or a router, remember that you'll still have to clean it up by hand. It can be tricky to feed a thin panel on edge past a table saw blade or a router bit. You may have to make several passes before you achieve the correct angle and depth. Since it's in the nature of these tools to leave surface marks, use the stiffest carbide-tipped blade and bit you can find and feed slowly. It will also be best to make several passes if you use the router table, because its bits are very large and making a cut of that size in one pass not only quickly dulls the bit, but is inherently unsafe.
Working by hand avoids all these problems and dangers. I find the pleasantest method is to use a long British badger plane.
This has a skewed blade that extends to the edge of its long sole, and properly sharpened and set up, produces a finished surface at any angle you need without any additional work to secure or protect the panel. Even if you use a badger with its skewed blade that's designed to produce a smooth cut across the grain, it's best to cut the ends of the panel first. Use a scrap block to prevent any breakout at the corner. Then, when you plane the long sides, you'll be able to remove any imperfections that might have occurred. The thing to aim for is a straight and sharp line at the junction of the side and end slopes. So allow for a few finishing strokes as you form each side, and don't plane right down to the line at once. Keeping a mallet on hand to gauge the thickness of the tongue is a really good idea. It saves a lot of trial, fitting and guesswork, and you can make one easily enough from the cut-off ends of the grooved panel members. Unfortunately, badger planes were never very common in America, so the next best thing is a skewed rabbit plane or even a regular jack plane, followed by a small metal rabbit to clean the corner. When the mallet slides easily along all four edges and the corner lines are sharp and straight, your panel will be ready for assembly. Well, now that we've seen how to make a basic raised and fielded panel, you might want to try something that's not completely rectangular. It's not too hard to make a panel for a curved frame, or one with an even more complicated outline, such as a series of mirrored ogis. Bandsaw the profile traced directly from the frame, allowing a little extra to fit in the frame's groove. And then, working by hand, use carving tools or an appropriately profiled router bit with a ball-bearing pilot to follow the profile. Here are a couple of useful tricks to bear in mind. If you arrange the groove so that the face of the panel is flush with the framing, it will look better if its sides are beaded. Then, if the panel shrinks, the gap between the bead and the framing will be less noticeable because of the quirk inside the bead. Incidentally, I like to use a beading plane to do this. They're easy to use and come in many sizes. Other choices might include a router or a simple scratch stop. The latter is very easy to make and also easy to use. One last thing you might want to do to achieve a more sophisticated look is, if you're using very wide panels, use a dab of glue or even fix a pin at the very center of the panel, usually from behind. This ensures that any dimensional change occurs equally at both sides, and you avoid the possibility of an ugly gap at one side or the other. So whatever your favorite methods of work may be, and whatever style you like to work in, I think you'll agree that frame and paneling offers a wide variety of almost limitless possibilities for all sorts of woodworking projects. Let wood do what wood wants to do, and you won't go far wrong.